we often will be in organizations and we'll hear from both sides of the story. So we'll be doing focus groups or something, and somebody say, "Oh my gosh, my boss is such a micromanager." And then we go to the boss, and he'll be like, "Oh my gosh, I wish I didn't have to micromanage my team. They're never accountable." Right?
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. Hey, so glad you joined us today. And if you're new here, make sure you subscribe. You're going to get some incredible guests. We have got Jim Collins, Malcolm Gladwell, Nona Jones, Sharon McMahon, Ed Stetzer, Andy Stanley, and a whole lot more coming up on the podcast. Also, Henry Cloud, did I mention that? And if you subscribe, you'll never miss an episode. Hey, today we've got two leaders that I'm excited to introduce you to, Karin Hurt and David Dye. A lot of you struggle with conflict at work. You have bad bosses. This is going to be hyper practical on exactly what to say to your boss, exactly what to say to your lazy coworker, and a whole lot more. Today's episode is brought to you by Upward Sports. Is your church eager to connect with the community and reach new families? Well, then you got to check out Upward Sports. It's the world's largest Christian youth sports organization. They want to support your church and to promote the gospel through sports. So all you have to do is visit upward.org/churchleaders to learn more. And today's episode is brought to you by Overflow. So if you are ready to see an increase in engagement in your church and maybe get rid of QR codes, and there are not too many QR codes these days, well, if you want to get rid of them, go to Overflow Tap. Overflow Tap enables your people to tap their phones during the service and access digital connection cards, event registration, giving, and a whole lot more. Just like you tap your phone to pay, you can do that in church. Go to overflow.co/Carey to learn more. And now my conversation with Karin Hurt and David Dye. So David and Karin, welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad to have you both.
Oh, we're so delighted to be here. Thanks for having us.
You're so welcome. So I want to start here. In the book that you co-authored, you surveyed over 5,000 people about conflict at work. What did you learn through that study?
Yeah, one of the reasons that we decided to do that study was because coming out of the pandemic, as you think about the workplace in general, things have changed. And we wanted to know what was happening today, what's current when it comes to workplace conflicts as we're getting ready to write this book about it. So we asked people, starting with the big picture question, are you experiencing more or less or the same conflict at work as in prior years? And 70% of the respondents, again, that's 5,000 plus people in 46 different countries, said that they are experiencing, 70% said, I'm experiencing the same or greater amounts of conflict. And, you look at the 30%, though, that said they're experiencing less. And then we dug in and said, well, okay, why is it less?
Yeah.
And half of those people said, well, it's because I escaped. So I right? I left a toxic workplace. I'm working entirely from home now, and I don't have to interact with anybody. Therefore, no conflict. And that might feel peaceful or great for that individual, but what is lost in all of that is also a lot of the collaboration and the creativity and the innovation that makes for better workplaces or gets better solutions. So whether we're talking about a church or a nonprofit or any kind of organization, there is a need for some of that creative tension that helps us to be better together. And that's lost, unfortunately, in that half.
That's funny. 30% said they escaped. I think there are a lot of leaders listening to the show who would be like, I would sign up for that. If it's a particularly bad day, I would love to escape.
Yeah. It's interesting. One of the questions we asked in the research is, what advice would you give your former self if you were faced with a major conflict that you've had in the past again? And it was fascinating. 55% said I would stay calm. And 21% said I would talk about it or talk about it sooner. And why... that is so important because you need, if you want to stay calm, you need more than somebody saying, calm down, right?
Yes.
You need tools to be able to ground yourself, to have the words that will lead to a more productive conflict conversation.
That's interesting, because I would probably give myself the same advice. And I certainly have gotten better at staying calm. That one came early for me, but delaying, I'm still guilty. I'm not a procrastinator, but when it comes to conflict, I can procrastinate.
And the
is
problem
that normal?
is,
oh yeah. Oh, yeah.
And most conflict does not get better with time, right?
True,
And part of what we see is people have like magical thinking. They're like, well, surely they know this is a problem, that they're not meeting my expectations, that they're doing this thing that's really derailing our team. They'll fix it themselves, right? And yeah, if nothing
that's
changes,
never worked for me, but I keep believing it will, just for the record. Okay.
Yeah. It's human nature, that
Yeah.
it's a survival mechanism, instinct of like, gosh, am I going to damage a relationship? Am I going to lose my status? All of these stories that play in our head. And I don't think there's anybody listening who can't identify with them at some point in their work and their career and their life. Like, it is part of human experience. So the sooner we can get into the conversation, the more productive outcomes we can get.
Yeah. Are there any other trends you've noticed? I think most of us, I would be on the majority side, who would say conflict seems to be getting worse. Not necessarily just from bosses who might be not conflict averse, but also just people throwing up flags going, hey, this isn't fair, or this is toxic, or whatever. The complaint side seems to be going up. The friction side, we live in a very tribalized society. Did any of that reveal itself in the research, or were there other trends you noted as well?
Yeah, it really did. So the two top, all these respondents, we identified a whole huge list of potential causes of the reasons for all this conflict. And the top two that came out were overwhelm, burnout, understaffing. And so all of that we can kind of easily wrap our head around. And tied with that was poor management practices and poor leadership. And before we get too upset at leaders, I know we have a lot of leaders listening. Leaders today are facing a more complex environment than any time in history, at least recent history. And so you take the changing workplace, you take, as you said, changing social trends, you take the needs of the workforce for more transparency, vulnerability, empathy, support. And many of these are good things that we would support and say, yes, this is a positive trend, but learning how to lead that way takes work. And in many of our organizations, you've got, bigger organizations, you've got some of the cross time zone and remote and hybrid and all these sorts of things, which leaders are still catching up to in many respects. And so all of that creates some, what we call conflict cocktails that create some challenging circumstances and some kind of new breeds of conflict. And then you also have, you're mentioning the polarization. That was right there in the top four, less tolerance, understanding for others, and then pandemic-related mental health and anxiety issues that continue to linger from, that global event that was certainly traumatic.
One of the biggest sources of conflict consistently is unclear expectations. And part of what has changed is that the world has changed so fast in many circumstances. And so we haven't let our expectations catch up with that. So, okay, you can work from anywhere. So you say to your staff, right? You can work from anywhere. That's just fine. Well, what does that actually mean? And so we had an example when we were, doing this research, and this person had posted on LinkedIn their work from anywhere policy, and they're like, "Thank goodness for our company's work from anywhere policy. I can do this from the petting zoo." And there's holding their computer with a Zoom thing, meeting up, and petting the pony on the other side of it, and then responding to everybody's comments. And, oh, isn't that cute? Da, 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 da. But meanwhile, their coworkers are like, hey, where's that email? Why didn't you get me that data you're supposed to do, right? And so do we really mean you can work from anywhere? Or should we have our cameras on or off in a meeting? There can be a lot of conflict around that if we have different expectations of what we really should be doing. And so one of the things that we find in our work with clients is one of the most important things to do is create better clarity of expectations. And, one good conversation about expectations can prevent all those why didn't you conflict conversations.
Okay, that might be my new favorite example for remote working, the petting zoo. I never would have imagined, but I want to walk through this. So most of the people listening to this, if my research is right, because churches are famous for this, don't have remote working policies. It might be a day or two a week, but generally they have an office, everybody's there. But I also know that my company's entirely virtual. So people live in different cities, different countries. And last year, I want to give you an example. We were hiring. And we have over 400 applications for this one position, heavy demand. And we had some filters. This one got into the top 100, but as soon as I read it, I'm like, gone, not even interviewing. So it was like, oh, I'm so excited by this remote opportunity. I can't wait to put in laundry in between meetings, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm like, I do that sometimes, but I wouldn't lead with that. You know what I mean? The reason I want this job, because I work from home, this is my house, is because I'm throwing in laundry. And we were so clear with our candidates. It's like, yes, it's working from home. Yes, it's flexible. Yes, it's a 4-day work week. But when you're on, and you're focused, and childcare is taken care of. I don't care how you do it, but you're going to be in a room with the door closed, cameras on. You're talking about that kind of clarity. Now, other people may have different views, and sometimes, people are working from coffee shops or a backyard or something like that. But the point is, when you're on, but we give you an incredible amount of freedom around that. Thoughts about that? What's good? What would you nuance?
I'd say that's very good because it's clear. And there's, as you said, there's no one solution for everybody. Somebody, coffee shop might be perfectly appropriate. And others, it may not be work at all. Like you need to be in a quiet environment with no background noise. Like that's just part of where, so being clear about what those things are and what those norms are helps everybody to get along better and resolve some of those issues that just don't need to be conflicts to begin with.
Yeah, Carey, I had an interesting conversation with a pastor of a fairly significant size organization recently. And he was saying that one of the biggest sources of conflict that he teaches his other pastors to really think about and how to approach it is, what can you say? So he says, I'm dealing with issues on the staff of the church, and I have to balance the privacy of the people that on my staff with all of all these other people who think they have a right to know everything that is going on because they're part of the congregation. And it is that he thinks that's one of the biggest sources of conflict, because he may be dealing to protect the privacy and the dignity of the person that he's working with, maybe to manage a performance conversation. And so he can't share everything that's going on with the congregation, but he also has an obligation to some level of transparency with the congregation. And so that to me may be something, that is somewhat more unique to a church than maybe some other organizations.
Oh, I feel for that pastor. I've been in that situation. And, I think by the end of the time when I was lead pastor, we'd figured out a formula just enough to protect, the person's dignity, whatever was happening, if it was a termination or something like that. Enough for the congregation, but somebody told me this years ago, always allow people to walk away with their dignity. And I think that's really, really important in any kind of situation, even if it's terrible. Not everybody needs to know everything. We're not the National Enquirer. On the other hand, the congregation is owed an explanation as to what happened. So it's a delicate thing. And I think for all those reasons, we kind of answered the next question, which is, leadership is a lot more complicated today. And you're dealing with in-person and virtual. You're dealing with, the demand. Like when we started doing a remote company 10 years ago, 8 years ago, it was novel. Now it's not novel. Freedom and flexibility around timelines was novel. It's not novel. And it's almost seen as an entitlement now, right? Well, you can get some rights. You just got to have some responsibilities in the mix of that. Okay, off soapbox. On to next question. So would love to know, because we're going to get hyper practical in this conversation, because your latest book is hyper practical. But I want to start with what doesn't work. So what methods of resolving conflict have you found a lot of people still use, but they're just not effective?
Yeah, in chapter 2 in the book, we actually talk about some of these. One of them are I statements, and the other is sandwich feedback. And I'm sure many listeners, if you've been to any kind of training or conflict type stuff in the past 10 or 15 years, you've encountered these. But I statements, there's an encouragement to begin, when you're having a conflict conversation, make sure and use I statements. Well, there is a legitimate reason why that's recommended, because you do open the door to good conversations if you start with your own experience. The problem is that saying, well, just use I statements gets convoluted. So it's like,
can you explain I statements? Like, give me an example. If you're going to correct me, what are you saying?
Sure, for sure. So like, if I were to start by saying, you, Carey, you really were a jerk in that thing, right? So that's a you statement. So as opposed to a good I statement would be something like, Carey, when we started the conversation and I said this and then that happened and I felt really uncomfortable in that situation and I was concerned about X, Y, or Z. So I'm owning my experience, my feelings.
Right.
The problem is that's when it's done well. The problem is they get convoluted. It's so easy to be like, I feel like you're a jerk, Carey. That's an I statement. But then, and so you watch people actually tangle up in their head going, well, I feel that I'm aware you, and it's just hard. So they have a place, but so we don't recommend trying to think that way. There's better ways to go about it. And then the other is sandwich feedback that we're not big fans.
So a sandwich feedback, for most of your listeners have heard it and probably have used it, where you say something nice and then you say what you really want to say and then you say something else nice. So for example, if I said, hey, David, I've got to really thank you. You really did a beautiful job preparing us for the Courageous Leadership Experience in Asia. Really went well.
Thanks.
But your leadership is derailing our company. But you're kind of hot. Now it's okay. We're married to each other. What is the only thing you're going to take away from that, right?
I'm hot.
So that's the problem with that, and sometimes with an open face sandwich is appropriate. If somebody comes to, if Carey, I came to you and said, hey, thanks so much for having us on the show. What's one thing that really worked well for you on the show? And what is one thing you would suggest we do better if we were to come on the show again? And it would be very appropriate, right? Like to give feedback like that. But if you're trying to get somebody's attention about an accountability conversation, like you want somebody to stop coming in late, you're not going to sandwich it. You're going to say, stop coming in late. This is the problem, right?
So I statements generally not a good idea. And I can see, I can imagine, in your example, Carey, you're a jerk. I could end up, or Carey, I experience your behavior. It seems like you're a jerk or something. I can say, well, I'm sorry you think I'm a jerk, right? And then I move on, right? To be a classic jerk thing to do. I can see I statements can get convoluted. I can see how the positive feedback sandwich or negative feedback sandwich can be, because you're right, you only hear the negative. You don't really hear the positive. So what does work? What's a better, because we're going to get super granular, but if you had an overarching strategy or summary of feedback that does work, what would you say it is?
Yeah, if we're talking specifically about feedback, opening the conversation with your intent for the conversation. So when we're getting to the super practical, specific words to say, one recommendation for feedback conversations is to open them with, my intent for this conversation is to help us resolve this issue that our teams have been having so that. And so it's my intent for this conversation is so that blank. And so my intent is whatever the thing is I want to achieve so that what's the positive outcome that's going to happen. So if I'm having a performance conversation with one of my staff, to say, my intent for this conversation is to help you with our, parishioner experience so that they're having the best possible experience and you're growing in your career and seen for all the skills that you do have, so that might be an example of how I might approach a feedback conversation, just opening the door to it. Once we've opened the door, that gives them a chance to step into that door with us. Like, oh yeah, I want that too. Then there are some other things that we can add to the conversation.
Yeah, and then you want to create some clarity about, what is the behavior that you're noticing. So I've noticed that you've been doing this, for example, and you give them the example, and then you show up really curious. How does this look from your perspective? Why do you think this is happening? It's so important to stay curious in these conversations because even if we think we know what's going on, sometimes we don't know what's going on. And so, and a lot of times we see managers, they go in, you must stop this. This is why it's a problem. And they don't show up curious. And then the person shuts down and doesn't feel seen. So start by creating clarity and notice what you've seen, get curious, and then move the conversation to some level of commitment towards what's going to happen next and next steps.
Question for you, and this is pretty granular, but a mentor who's been very influential in my life told me years ago, one of his values is believe the best and always assume the best about a situation. So I'm frustrated with a team member's performance. But one of the things my mentor said is always assume, always try to find the most charitable explanation. Maybe she's overwhelmed. Maybe he's got something else going on. Maybe he did it and I'm not aware of it, like it's actually done and completed, etc. Is that helpful when framing the conversation you're going to have to kind of have that charitable assumption, that best possible explanation?
I think the answer is yes in the framing for us because of what it does to our emotional state. So if I can approach that conversation and say there are a potential range of possibilities here, and I genuinely don't know. That's like, what Karin was saying about getting curious.
Yeah.
So one of our favorite go-to, there are over 300 phrases and powerful phrases for dealing with workplace conflict. And one of our favorites is, how does this look from your perspective? What does this look like from where you are? And it's such a powerful question because if we can go in with the acknowledgement of we don't know, we have one perspective. We might imagine 5 or 10 others, but we ultimately don't know. So to have that conversation with ourselves, like you just described, Carey, can de-escalate some of our own stress and frustration around it. Here's what I can guarantee. There's almost no chance that person woke up in the morning, brushed their teeth thinking, how can I really tick off Carey today?
Yeah.
And I think, we talk about this in one of our other books in Winning Well, but the importance of landing in the and of confidence and humility. And you don't want to over-index on the other side of things too, and just be so humble and so giving everyone the benefit of the doubt that you don't have the confidence to stand up for what matters and to speak the truth. And so it's really showing up in these conversations with both.
Well, and that's what I found so helpful about the way you frame conflict, because, we were talking about this before we hit record. In my perception, pastors either come down like a hammer. It's like boom, 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 rah, rah, rah. Or they're so conflict avoidant, they don't deal with it or only after great reluctance. And I wonder if one of the reasons we delay so much, and even me, is there's no good third option. It's either I delay or I come down like a hammer, and I have the personality that can do that. I personally do.
Yeah.
And so I delay and I procrastinate as a result. Any comment on that tendency, or what else have you seen in your research?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of research around exactly that tendency to describe either conflict avoidance or when I do in the hammer in faith-based organizations, nonprofit, anybody has a service orientation, you tend to see those polar opposites in the culture of those organizations. There is a tendency without the tools that those things can happen. And so that's why it's so important to have the tools, because there is another way, which is to invest in the relationship and go for the results that need to be achieved too. And you can absolutely do that. So that's what all of the powerful phrases are about, is absolutely having that third way. So we do see that all the time.
Okay, so I pay attention to endorsements. Seth Godin said the 12 goats are worth the price of the book. And I'm like, all right, I gotta take a second look here. So much respect for Seth. Can you walk us through some of the greatest of all time, the GOAT phrases and the framework that you have for resolving workplace?
Can you see the little goat peeking in on my window there?
So there he is. Yeah, there's the goat. I do see him.
Up a little bit. So this is our connection goat. So there's a little Wi-Fi signal for connection. So we have 4 dimensions of productive conflict, or the opposite of productive conflict. Another word is collaboration, 4 dimensions of collaboration. And one is connection. Are we connected as human beings? And then so for each of these, we have a couple of goats. So, one is, I really care about, and then you insert the thing that you really care about, that you genuinely really care about. I really care about you. I really care about our relationship. I really care about this project that we're working on together. And I'm confident that we can find a solution we can work with here. Now, this one works great if you really do care. But if you have a reputation of that they say, hey, I'm not sure that you actually care about me, that's not your best one. But that is a very powerful GOAT that you can use in almost any situation. Another is
And
simply
before we move from that one, I just want to pause on this because of the specific audience we're talking with here. Is that sometimes we can assume, and I've coached many faith-based leaders in this context who can assume that their people have that understanding. Well, everyone cares about everyone here because of our mission, because of our DNA, because of who we are. And the thing is, you can't assume that. It has to be spoken. It has to be said. It has to be put into practice, and with our hands and with our voice and all of that. It's not an assumption we can make because it's still that the connection doesn't happen unless we really truly invest in it.
Yeah. And then another connection goat is simply tell me more. So if somebody comes, bursting into your office and they're all fired up about something, before you counter and share your point of view, say, wow, it sounds like you're really upset. Tell me more about what's going on. And that will immediately de-escalate because they're like, oh, this person is actually going to listen to me and cares about what I have to say next.
Yeah.
So those are a couple of connection goats. David, you want to give some clarity goats?
Well, sure. Carey, it sounded like you were starting to say something.
No, I was going to say, tell us more, but
tell you more. Okay.
I'm practicing what I just heard. Yeah.
There you go. I love it. So clarity, Karin mentioned earlier that so many conflicts at work result from that lack of shared understanding. So clarity is, do we have a shared understanding of success? And so one of the most important goats in this category is, what would a successful outcome do for you? And this is so critical because so often we default to, well, I want this meeting to happen at this time in this way and with these people. So, okay, well, that's the thing that I'm immediately presenting. But if I can ask the person, so what would a successful outcome do for you? Now I find out why they want those things. And if I know that why, if I know that underlying interest, now I'm in a position to start genuinely creating some shared solutions. I share my interest transparently. Here's what a successful outcome would do for me. It would help me get home to see my family by this time. And what it sounds like it would do for you is it would really give you the experience you need to take that next step in your career that you're looking for. Okay, well, now that we know that, now we can start trying to craft some solutions that meet both of our needs.
That is so helpful because the way I would have phrased the question is, what would a successful outcome look like? But having read a lot of his work and just spent a couple hours interviewing William Ury, I'm sure you're familiar with his work. That's the difference between positions and interests, right? Yes. What would this look like as a position? It would look like this meeting is done by 3:00 so that I can get home and be with my family, but you will never get to so I can be home. What would it do for you? That's a really helpful question because it does get to the why underneath the what. I just wanted to, is that a right understanding of that?
100%.
Exactly right.
Yep.
Okay. Brilliant.
Absolutely.
Can you outline the 4-part framework that you have?
Yeah, for sure. So starting with connection, that's what Karin was talking about. Do we know one another as human beings? Clarity. Do we have a shared understanding of success? Curiosity. Are we genuinely open to seeking out different perspectives and other answers to the questions? And then commitment, which is not, oh, I'm super committed. It's, do we have a shared path forward together? Do we have a shared agreement and ways to practically hold ourselves accountable to what it is that we've committed to? So those are the 4 dimensions that we mentioned earlier.
Can you give us a couple more goats from curiosity and commitment, maybe? We've covered the first 2, but would love to hear a little more.
Yeah, so curiosity. One of our favorites is, what does this look like from your perspective? Like, you can hardly go wrong in any conflict by asking that. What does that look like from your perspective? And then let the person actually finish their sentence before you comment, right? Yeah. And, then commitment, what is one next step we can agree on? And I love that one, particularly if you are really coming at things from completely different worldviews. And, we really have a fundamental problem here. Okay, so we're going to go in that kind of conflict, you're going to go around and around and around. But if you can say, okay, well, what is one thing we can agree on? Okay, now you've at least got some common ground and you've narrowed what you're going to continue to talk about. And another commitment goat is, okay, so let's schedule some time. We've agreed to this. Let's schedule some time to talk about how our solution is working. And this one is so important because if you put a date on the calendar, you're going to talk about it again. We're both looking at that date going, okay, I better pay attention to how I'm showing up and meeting my commitment here. And if something doesn't happen, neither one of you have to summon the courage to start the conversation again. You've already scheduled it. And if it's working well, you don't have to remember to celebrate and say thank you. You've already scheduled it. So, and that is one of the reasons so many conflicts just keep recurring because they're not focusing on this moving towards a shared agreement.
So you're dealing with workplace conflict, but it seems to me like this could be a good template for life. Is that true? Like, is this going to make your marriage a little bit better? Your friendships a little bit better? That awkward, family of origin conversation, is it going to make it all better?
I certainly believe so. Karin and I practice these phrases ourselves. I'm always in process on these. And I'll tell you, like, just transparently, the one that I am continually working on is to use that GOAT that Karin mentioned. I'm curious how this looks from your perspective. I spent the first half of my life investing in clarity. I'm like, I need to get curious. And so I'm trying to do that more and more often. But and I've been thinking about this as we've been talking to Carey in terms of volunteers, because so often it's easy to think, well, I can't hold volunteers accountable. I can't give feedback. I can't. And the reality is that if we truly value their time and effort, the more clear we are and the more we practice that investment and make that time that they are investing in whatever that work is, the more we make that meaningful and productive, the more volunteers you're going to get as opposed to driving them away. So it's like one of those things that we can use these phrases in so many different aspects of our work and life.
Yeah, I also am thinking about religious education too. And, when you've got volunteers teaching youth, and sometimes that can be really challenging, right? To have those conversations. You've got other people's kids. And, I was thinking about, the other day, we got a note from Sebastian, is our 18-year-old, and his calculus teacher wrote to Sebastian and said, can you ask your mama to give me some powerful phrases to deal with this classroom that I'm dealing with right now? And it was, she needed to create some connection, some clarity. And so I think, that you can use these across a variety of contexts.
Wow. I want to go back for a second to volunteers because you actually touched on a nerve, and I think you're right. A lot of leaders think they cannot hold volunteers accountable because we're not paying them. They're doing this out of the goodness of our heart. Have you seen in your framework, because I've done quite a bit of teaching around this to leaders, and my argument is exactly what you were saying, that you should hold volunteers accountable, but in my experience, and I want to know if this is borne out, the healthier and the higher capacity of the volunteer, the more they want clarity, the more they want accountability. That's true of your staff, but it's also true of your volunteers. If you can spell this out in detail and hold me accountable and call a big commitment out of me, I'm going to be a better volunteer as a result, and you will attract the top talent in your church. What do you find in that area?
If I had a Roman candle or fireworks to go, yes, and celebrate and explode, I would. So this is something I am passionate about. One of my leadership beliefs, mantras, is that everyone is a volunteer. Whether they are paid, whether they're compensated in some fashion or not, everyone is a volunteer, because at the end of the day, we are all making a choice about how much effort, creativity, initiative, energy we are going to put into whatever it is that we are doing in that moment. You can say, well, but if they're paid, they have to. Well, that's still a choice that they make. And they still choose how much of all that they're going to bring to the table. So we have everyone's volunteering. Everything that you just said about the capacity and the clarity and the value that person experiences determines what they're going to put in 100%. And I cannot emphasize or say, heck yeah, enough.
Karin, have you seen a similar thing?
Yes. And David is not sharing a story that he often shares about when he was held accountable by a volunteer very early in his career. And she said, hey, if you don't stop wasting my time by letting all these other bozos get away with all this stuff, I'm going to find someplace else to volunteer, And I think, and I know how I'm busy. Right? I'm a very busy person. And so when I go to volunteer, like, do not waste my time, right? So I really do, understand that story because I'm very willing to roll up my sleeves and help, but I want to know that it's a good use of my time to help.
Well, I know we're going in different directions, but I would just think, and for every leader listening right now, imagine having David and Karin as part of your congregation, incredibly busy consultants, probably very well paid for what you do. The best way to get a couple like that involved is to give them a high challenge. This has got to be important, not just stand around. And if it's mopping floors, I'm sure you would do that, but like explain the why behind the what. But give them a high level of responsibility, a clear plan, do your homework, don't miss deadlines with them, and, negotiate the workload. So if it becomes too much, we can have a conversation about it. But if you do that, you'll have more high capacity volunteers. So glad we touched on that. So you talk about body language in conflict too. This is something I really struggle with because my default resting face is not good. It looks like I'm perpetually angry at the world. So I try to smile in conversations like this because otherwise I'm just going to like, "Ugh." And I'm happy on the inside, but I haven't told my face. So what role does body language play and what advice would you have for us in that field?
So, your people will believe your body language more so than the words that are coming out of your mouth. If they're going to, and there's a lot of research that says that so, and I'm thinking about, how you show up. So it's your posture, right? Are you closed off? Are you open? It is, what is your face doing? Fortunately now, I mean, not that I love being online all the time, but you do get to see your own face quite a bit. And you also get to, other people can see your reaction. And something David and I have really had to work with. It was interesting when we first started working together. It was hard because we had both run our own businesses and then we fell in love and got married and merged our businesses together. And we did not do things always the same. And we were working with a client very early on. And David did something that really ticked me off. And he
legitimately so. Legitimately.
And he pulled me aside. He's like, that look on your face, you have to change it. You can be as mad at me as you want, but everybody is watching the way you are looking at me right now, right? And there were not words coming out of my mouth except to him. But he's like, and he was 100% right. So what is your face saying to the person in the conflict? But what is your face and body language saying to the bystanders as well?
So what would you say to those of us? I mean, this is very real in my life. Like in the last 24 hours, my wife and I got into a disagreement and she goes, well, it wasn't just, you didn't say anything, but it was your body language. And I'm like, I don't have control over my body language. Like you got to go with my mouth, not like what I'm saying, not what I'm doing, but clearly I have some work to do. So if you're like me and the body language is not always in sync with what your heart or mind are doing, what tips do you have for those of us who struggle in this area?
Yeah, so this is a great opportunity to use some of these conversation tools that we've been suggesting. So, today or another day where it's not in the middle of that argument, it could be totally, and Karin and I have to have these conversations with each other sometimes, right? It's just human relationships. And we can do it at work too. I heard the other day that you were talking about my body language and how I was coming across. I am curious how that actually looks from your perspective. Can you give me some examples? What was it I was doing? How was I coming across? What did you perceive in that moment? Okay, so that we can at least know. And once we have data, we can start to make decisions about what's possible, what's not, what changes do we want to make, what changes do we not want to make, all those sorts of things. But if I can start by getting curious and getting that information, that can be helpful.
And then I think another thing is, can you watch, is there a recording that you can watch of what actually happens? And so that's another place to get data. But then, part of it is to pay attention to a couple of things. Are you really looking the person in the eye? Are you smiling? Are you, not like, not a big fake smile that I'm really, really angry at you right now, but a genuine, are you really in it? And part of it is, what is it that you want your body language to say? And then the other thing is, I would just watch your closed or open. I mean, that's the simplest way, right? Because you can, in most rooms, Like I was just working with the executive team the other day, and I said to one of the most senior leaders, I said, "Did you notice what happened?" Let's call him Joe. I said, "Did you notice what happened to Joe at dinner?" And I said, "Joe was sitting like this." And if you're just listening, he was like literally curled up in a little ball at the dinner table when a certain topic came up. And he said, "I didn't notice." So part of that is,
Wow.
being aware of your own body language, but also being aware of what what you're saying is doing to the body language of the others in the room.
Okay, I want to get to the practical, but I got to ask you one more. I mean, this is very practical, but there's some very specific things I want to cover with you. A lot of church leaders struggle and they want to quit because conflict is too difficult. It's just like this church or this organization or this company is always fighting. They're always arguing. It's in the culture. What advice do you have for them? And any thoughts on when there's too much conflict to continue?
It's a great question. I think, and there's two aspects to this, because there's, when do you quit a conflict? I'm going to leave that for Karin, because the first thing that you talked about is, if I'm in this culture, there's just so much conflict and everybody's arguing about everything. It's just kind of the nature of things. From a leadership perspective, there's a leadership opportunity there to help focus everybody's vision on what it is that matters most, on what we're trying to achieve, on the work that we're doing. One of my favorite examples, if you've seen the movie Apollo 13, then they record this, and this is what actually happened. You read the biography. They're trying to get this damaged spaceship back to Earth, and the astronauts are all arguing with each other, and then they're distracted, taking pictures out the window and everything. And finally, Captain Lovell says, "Hey guys, I want to get back home. Like, that's our mission. Like, what are we doing here? And call us all back to the big picture." And that is the job that every leader has, right? Without a vision, the people perish, right? So it's that getting that vision back in front of us and helping. We need to have conflict. We need to have productive, collaborative decision conversations that should all be taking us in that direction. So if it's not about going in that direction, there's an opportunity to call us back to that.
Yeah,
So,
and
Karin,
to have the conversation about the habits that are going to have you be more collaborative. One of the things that we have is a card deck that we use with teams that go with the 4 dimensions. And on every card, there is a habit. And so one of the things you can do is, to think about, all right, what are the 2 or 3 habits that if we did them consistently would create better collaboration and less conflict? And have people talk about that and make an agreement and alignment. Like, we're not going to do these destructive behaviors. Instead, we're going to do these things. And I think sometimes just having the conversation before you're in what we call an ACE, an acute conflict emergency, that this is how we're going to roll. Seth Godin, you love, people like us do things like this. That's culture. And so on a team, can we align that this is how we're going to go? People like us do things like this. And we don't do that, and so I think that's one way to do it. And then David alluded to, when to quit a conflict. Sometime I do have a good friend who is a minister who did quit. And, he is now in a different congregation and it's going much better, So sometimes, so have I tried? Is one question. Yeah. Have I really tried to have the conversation, or has the conversation only been in my head and I never gave the other people on the staff or the congregants an opportunity to engage in this conflict? Is it impacting my mental health, right? Like, am I going home so stressed that I am weeping into the paws of my Labradoodle? Like, that's not good. Another question to ask yourself is, do I like who I'm showing up as, right, in this? If all of a sudden you are feeling like you are the jerk in these conversations, that you are taking on these negative behaviors, you don't like who you are, you do not feel like you are a good shepherd or steward of of the message that you're trying to give, that's a sign. And then another question to ask, I think, is a really important one, which is there a pattern? Like, do I keep showing up and am I having the same kind of conflicts at home as I'm having at church, as I'm having, in my community? Then maybe the common denominator is something that you're doing. right? And that leaving the situation isn't going to fix it. You're going to have to fix the behavior. So we have a whole chapter on how do you decide whether to quit a conflict.
All right. Well, I want to do a bit of a lightning round and go through some different scenarios because it's so helpful. Another frequent question I get is, love your podcast, love your writings. I'm not the senior leader. What do I do with a senior leader who's being difficult? So I want to ask some boss questions.
Okay.
What's your advice for a micromanaging boss? You got a boss who doesn't give you any freedom. What would you do?
All right. So here's David's looking at me because this is one of my favorite. So because we often will be in organizations and we'll hear from both sides of the story. So we'll be doing focus groups or something, and somebody say, "Oh my gosh, my boss is such a micromanager," and then we go to the boss, and he'll be like, "Oh my gosh, I wish I didn't have to micromanage my team. They're never accountable, right?" And so the first question is, ask yourself this question, like, are they really a micromanager, or is there something about your performance that is causing them to having to micromanage you? And so and we have a series of questions to go through to ask that question, but let's assume they really are a micromanager. Then you want to lean in and have that conversation. And so, David, do you want to do a few of those?
I'm sorry, Karin. I had taken my thoughts a completely different direction. You
one of the things that you can really do there is, hey, I've noticed. I've noticed that you have checked in 5 times this week about this project. And I'm curious what's going on and what does this look like from your perspective? Am I not giving you updates that you need? Are you concerned that I don't have the skill sets to do this? What is causing you to check in on this? Because here's the impact. This is what it looks like to be me in this scenario. Every time you stop and ask me to run a report or do a check-in, and I got to go check in with all these people to give you an update, is time that I'm not spending working on the work. And so, that's a way. One of the ways is to just actually have that conversation. What can I do to support you here so that you feel more comfortable in letting me own this?
Anything else on micromanaging, David, or we don't have to belabor it?
The last thing helpful. I would add on top of, in addition to what Karin said, is once you know that, then specifically make your commitment and ask for what you need. And now that you know what their problem is or what they're trying to solve for, I think that's the last thing that Karin was saying. I just fleshed that out of, well, how about we do this? I'll get you your report at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, and in between, unless there's an emergency. Can you leave it alone, and I'll make sure and get you your briefing you need, or whatever it is.
What about a boss who steals your ideas and takes credit for them?
This is an interesting one in that a lot of times we just were talking with a client group last week, and one of the people at the table said, "If you're an idea stealer, you know it." And it was so interesting, said with so much vehemence. And the reality is, no, they often don't know that they're an idea stealer. People are moving quickly and they hear the idea and then they build on it. And if they're creative and a visionary type, like they've built 17 layers on top of that idea and run with it. They don't know where the kernel came from and they're just off and going. And so to come back to that and have that conversation, you can open the door with hey, I noticed that, and that's another stem that we like for a lot of these conversations. I noticed that this happened, and I'm sure that wasn't the intent. I noticed that you had proposed this idea, and that's something I came up with, and I want to make sure that people are understanding my contribution. Can I present that? Can I share so getting the clarity, asking for what you need, and that is one way to approach that.
Yeah, you could say, "Hey, do you think so and so, like your boss, understands my role in this?" So if it's your boss who steals your idea and looks like they're taking credit, "Hey, do you think your boss actually understands my role in it? Because, I really care about my reputation and this is something I'm super proud of." And then ask for what you need. Do you think the next time this topic comes up, you can either share a little bit about my role or give me a piece of the conversation so that I can share some of my insights about this? I used to teach a MBA course and the elective was dealing with difficult people. And the students had to bring a difficult person to be their project for the whole semester. 99% of the people picked their boss, and almost everyone came with the same problem. My boss steals credit for my ideas. And what we found is once they actually went and had these conversations, most of the time the boss is like, at least they said, I was not aware that I didn't mean to do it, but whether they meant to or not, they fixed it because it was called out to have the conversation and they stopped doing it and gave the people more credit.
Moody bosses.
Oh.
I may have been guilty of this in the early years of leadership until I learned about self-regulating and self-awareness. Moody bosses, tips there.
I had a CEO one time who talked about moody, and he literally said, "David, there are people laughing in the break room. What's going on? Don't they know how important this is?" And this was a very mission driven. This is not like you might be listening going, okay, well, that's not my church or whatever, but it's a very mission driven organization. And in moments of stress and things, like we could all get there. So, going back to our dimensions, the first dimension is to start with connection. You don't have to agree with how your boss is feeling or perceiving the world, but you can reflect it. We call this reflect to connect. Hey, sounds like this is really aggravating to you. Sounds like you're having a really hard time with XYZ situation right now. Is that right? And just to connect at that human level and reflect back the emotion that they are putting out into the world does two things. One, it lessens the intensity of that emotion for them. Second, they are seen with that emotion, which now creates awareness for them so that they can start to do some of that self-regulation if they have that in their toolkit. So that's a starting place, is we can build some connection. Then you can actually get into talking about it. So once you've connected, say, I'm noticing, let's say it's a pattern. I've noticed that the last 3 Fridays, as we're getting to the end of the week and preparing for the weekend and services and all, that this is happening. And with specific, remember on this date, here's what happened. Remember we were in that meeting and then so-and-so said this and then you went, and so forth. So we call attention to it. And then I'm wondering what's going on for you here. I'm curious how this looks from your perspective. So to draw out the source of the frustration. And again, sometimes that sensitizes the person to, oh my goodness, I need to act differently here, if they're an equipped leader. Other times it may be like, okay, let's try to solve for that.
This is so helpful because the number one thing I get when I talk to leaders is a shrug of resignation. This is just the way it is. Or I have this book on moody bosses. I want to give it to my boss. And I'm like, yeah, that never really works. But what I love about your strategies are they put the onus back on the person with the grievance. They say, you've got a role in this. You have a potential solution here. And that is terrifying. It is way easier to complain about your boss every night than it is to try to make the situation better. So I want to continue. Indecisive bosses. And this ties in a little bit because you do hear this. You have a driven young leader who's like, go, 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 go. But I'm in my 50s, so the boss is in his 50s and he's just kind of coasting and he's lost some of the drive. What do you get when you get an indecisive, or what do you do when you have an indecisive or a bit of a lazy leader that you're under?
Yeah, so you want to start with connection. So I'm going to go through the dimensions, right? So start with connection. I really care about, right? I care about this work that we're doing, something that you really care about. And then, I think it's really showing up curious about what is causing your hesitation here. Because one of the things, and I have dealt with a lot of indecisive bosses in my career. So I was at a Fortune 30 company for 20 years before I founded Let's Grow Leaders. And, I had good ones and bad ones. And some of the ones that were indecisive, I found like often they were dealing with a lot of political pressures that I did not fully understand. And when I got to understand, well, what is causing their hesitation, then I knew what I could do to bring them additional data to support, to manage the political things that they were so worried about. And then another one is to, say, hey, there's 2 ways we could go here. We could go with option A or we could go with option B. My suggestion is, so you're bringing clarity. My suggestion is we go with option A because of like, here's your rationale.
Mm-hmm.
And then move towards commitment. Do you, is that something you can agree to here? So you're making it easier. And then the other, one of my favorite things to do, this was like my go-to when I was in those roles, was to make make it easier for them to make a decision by making the decision smaller. Like, okay, so we don't need to roll this out for all of our locations. But maybe if we just pilot this at this one church for this one service and see how that will go, right? And to make that easier also can help.
What about the lazy boss? The boss who's coasting.
And I would start by asking myself, like, what are the behaviors? And this is in any kind of feedback situation, is to acknowledge that as soon as we say a word like lazy, we are making an interpretation. So what is it that I am perceiving as lazy? And one of the techniques that we'd recommend that you do, don't actually do this in practice. This is an imagination exercise, but imagine that you pulled out your phone and hit that video record button and recorded the situation, the meeting, the whatever it is that's happening. And even if you had to like record it all day and then imaginary, put it on fast forward and play, and then narrate what you're observing. What is it that's happening? Oh, so I gave them that paper with all of the information they'd asked for, and then they put it in a drawer and they never looked at it again. Oh, okay. So what is it you're describing? Because that's the information you want to bring to the conversation. If you bring an accusation of, hey boss, you're lazy. Well, that's just not going to work. Right now we're
I hope
back
your
to
stuff's packed up. That was a good last
right
day.
Now we're back to that's a you statement. So where do we start? Right. So, hey, my intent for this conversation is I want to make sure that we are serving our congregants, or that we are being as our stewardship of our financial resources is just primo, whatever it is that you're interested in. And so I want to have this conversation so we can accomplish that, so that we're doing our best for whoever. All right. So my intent is so that I'm going to open the door to the conversation. And then using some of the language we talked about earlier, hey, I noticed that when I gave that information that it went in a drawer and we never had the conversation again. And then ask for what you want. I am wondering, can we make a commitment to review that on Friday, to get that information by XYZ date? And in that process, I can also, does that work for you? I'm curious if there's any other considerations I'm not aware of or that I need to think about. So I'm showing up with sincerely describing what's going on with my intent. I'm getting curious about what might be going on for them, but then I'm asking for the commitment that will help us to move forward. And I'm doing all of that without any judgment about their behavior. It's the facts that are neutral, may be lazy, may have other things, like Karin said, that I have no idea what's going on.
Any thoughts on the inconsistent boss? One day she's super happy, the next she's down. One day she's, pretty easygoing, the next she's angry. Thoughts about that?
Well, so I'll tell you about this. So I had my very first little self-published book that I wrote way back long ago was called Overcoming an Imperfect Boss. And it was somewhat inspired by this one imperfect boss because we are all imperfect, right? We're all just human beings doing the best we can with what we can do, right? But she was that way. Like sometimes she was the best boss ever. Sometimes she was so frustrating and so moody, but also inconsistent. And so we gave her two Barbie dolls. And one was on the one Barbie doll was like, we messed up the hair and we put magic marker all over the face. And then the other one was like totally, because she wore pearls all the time. So one was totally immaculate with the pearls. And we said, look, there are two yous. And sometimes you're this and sometimes you're that. And she had a good sense of humor. And so we said, put these out on your desk just so we know which one we're dealing with. And so we made it like, we brought it to her attention, but in a funny way. Now, I don't think that would work for every boss, but basically it was saying, hey, I've noticed this pattern and let's talk about it, And so, I think you have to think about what approach will work, but mostly it's like with any of these other behaviors, showing up with genuine connection, getting curious about what's going on and figuring out what you can do to be helpful. I will tell you, sometimes I can get very riled up, and what my team could do to be helpful would be to do what they're supposed to be doing. Right. So, like part of that, why is your boss moody? Is there genuine performance, something that's happening here?
Well, and I love how it puts power back in the hands of the complainer, rather than just roll your eyes every day and complain about work. Let's talk about coworkers. You're on a team together. So, this brought me back to high school projects, which even my kids hated. I hated them. But there's usually, 5 people on this project and 1 or 2 do all the work and everybody else is lazy. That translates into the adult workplace as well. What do you do with a lazy coworker?
Yeah. And Carey, I want to come back to something you said a couple of times here about empowering the person who has the observation, right? And whether it's with our boss, whether it's with a coworker, and that can feel frightening. That can feel like, oh my gosh, it's terrifying, I think was the word you said.
Harder than complaining.
Right. Mm-hmm. And the reality is nothing changes if nothing changes. And if you're the one with the observation, then you're the only one with the opportunity to say or do something about it. Because if we're being fair to the other human beings in our life, they have limited perspectives just like you do. And so the world's going to look different. It doesn't mean that your observation and your interpretation isn't correct. But most of the time, there's more to it than that. And so giving other people that same benefit of the doubt, like you mentioned earlier, that we give ourselves, and therefore having the conversation from a place that's non-judgmental, but it's bringing the connection, that's bringing the clarity, that's bringing the curiosity, like that's what makes all of this possible. So you've mentioned it a couple of times. I just wanted to elaborate on that as we
ask for what you need. I think that sometimes we make assumptions. Well, they know the impact that they're having on me. But if you can say, hey, what I've noticed that, this is happening, whatever the thing that you're interpreting as lazy. Again, don't use the word lazy, but whatever you're interpreting, I've noticed that I'm consistently getting this report late. And I've got to tell you the impact that that's having on the rest of the team's ability to do their work. I'm curious how it's going on from your perspective. And you might find out as it turns out, they're not lazy. They are slammed with something else, or maybe they are lazy, but you say, okay, you hear I don't know. I'm just, okay, well, here's what I need. I really need the report by 3:00. Can you do that? Can you make that happen? Right. And they tell you they can't possibly do it. Well, then now you're in escalate the conversation to somebody different, but at least you're calling it out, because sometimes what happens is we say, well, they're lazy. I'm just going to work around them or work harder. And you can only do that for so long before you blow your gasket, right?
And there are times where the system is the issue. And so it is wholly appropriate at times to share your perspective. You have that conversation with your colleague or your teammate, and they're like, yeah, I don't see it that way. You're like, well, I see it this way, and that's my interpretation of what's going on. You know what? Would you come with me to talk to our supervisor, to talk with our manager? Because I'd really like to sort this out so that the whole team is feeling good about this, and we're all working equally and doing whatever our things are we're supposed to be doing. But I just want to make sure it's good. And so I'm not going around them. I invite them to go have that clarifying conversation with me. And that's another powerful phrase is, hey, can we go talk about this together with our manager?
So I'm just going to try this out on you, but we've been talking for the last 15, 20 minutes about very specific scenarios, kind of role-playing them. It would seem to me that if you embrace the behaviors you're advocating as a non-senior leader, it's a pretty sure ticket to a promotion. Is that the case? Like what you're describing are the kind of people that I would want to be at the top of an organization.
We say, be the leader you want your boss to be. And, and so if you can step in and be the one who's creating connection, better clarity, you can create clarity without being the boss. Hey, what's most important here? What does successful outcome do for you? All those questions. Showing up really curious and leading towards commitment. Yeah, those are the kinds of people I'd like to promote too, Carey.
Absolutely.
Well, before we go, it's an incredibly practical book. We'll get to it in just a second. But one of the other challenges is we've talked a lot about individuals, one-on-one, my boss, my coworker, et cetera. But there's a lot of leaders, particularly in nonprofits or donor-led or churches, that have to deal with chronic complainers or bullies. You got 1,000 people, 100 people, and there's this faction, there's this group. Any thoughts on group dynamics when you're dealing with that constant thorn in your side?
So this The bully and chronic complainers, I'm going to separate out a little bit, because if it's true bullying, there's a place to take a stand and say that behavior is not appropriate here, not in our context, that doesn't align with our values. And I have, as a leader in a service-based, nonprofit, faith-based organization, I have had to do that with somebody who was ultimately contributing numbers that ended with many, many zeros. And that's hard to do, but it's necessary. So if you're talking about bullying behavior, it's a stand up to it.
I will add that I confronted a minister of a congregation that I was part of because there was so much bullying going on, and she said she wouldn't address it, and I left. Right. So I really think, and to your point, I was a good volunteer. So,
I bet you were. I bet you were, Karin.
Who was contributing some significant resources, right? So, the people who have strong values are not going to stand for that if you allow that in your congregation.
Yeah.
So
that's the bullying. Then on the chronic complaining side, there are two kinds of chronic complainers, and it's important to know which you're dealing with. The first type of chronic complainer complains because complaining makes them feel good. I don't understand it, but it does. So like I say, like, this is the person who's getting a coconut hand massage with coconut oil at a resort, and they will complain because the lotion smells like coconut. Like, they're just going to complain about whatever. And in order to figure out if that's who you're dealing with, to say, hey, I've heard you mention this a couple of times, and it sounds like you're unhappy about what's going on. Okay. That does sound frustrating. And I reflect, that does sound frustrating. Do you want to make it better? What does better look like? And what are you willing to invest to get there? And if they're like, yeah, no, I'm not. Okay, done. I extract myself from that conversation, and I'm not going to give that a lot of airtime. On the other hand, if I talk to someone who is chronically complaining because they genuinely care, but maybe they don't know how to express it, maybe they don't know how to move to solution, then from a leadership or an influence perspective, I can help that person by saying, hey, it sounds like you're concerned about X. Do I have that right? Yeah. And what else? Tell me more. Okay. And what do you see as the consequences if, and get them to explain that? Well, what would it feel like if we could solve for that? Oh, so then they're starting to envision the possibilities. And then how do you think we can address this? And so then I'm starting to draw them into some solutions. And if they're still struggling, I'm going to say, okay, what if you could snap your fingers, wave a wand? What would you like to see happen? So I'm moving them from complaining to constructive thought about solution focus. And then I can summarize, well, it sounds like you want to do this. Is that right? And this is how we can approach that? Yeah, okay. And then we get some clarity around that, maybe even get some commitment to next steps or whatever that could look like for them, or put it together, write it up, whatever is appropriate. And then again, bringing the conversation to a close if they are used to chronic complaining. I'm glad we had this conversation. And so putting the conversation in the past tense, I'm glad we had this conversation, helps to tie a bow, because now I need to move on to some other things.
Well, one more. I think you touched on it in your book. I can't remember exactly. Gossip. Problem at work. Shouldn't be a problem in the church. It is. Any tips on how to have a gossip-free culture?
Yeah, a gossip-free culture. So I think one is to make it clear that gossip, as you are communicating your covenants and the way you're talking, that that's not how people like us do things around here. So to address it and to create clarity as a culture. But what do you do if the gossip is about you and you're in church, right? And one of the ways that I have dealt with this in the past, and I was worked in a very male-dominated organization. I was one of a very few women at the level that I was at. And from time to time, there was all kinds of weird gossip. For some reason, I think had something to do with that, whether men didn't think I should be in that position. I don't know what. But there was actually a circumstance where there was a rumor going around that I was in love with the only other female who was a direct report on my team, and that we were going to Jamaica together on some secret squirrel holiday. Now, I had toddlers. If I were going to go to Jamaica, it would not have been on something like, it would have been with like a diaper bag, right? And I used humor in that circumstance. And I said, the scene that you're describing here is a lot more interesting than my actual life, or that sounds like a really interesting movie that I would love to see, but it has nothing to do with what's actually happening here. And so that, if humor, if you can, in that circumstance, the humor stopped it. But in another circumstance, you could go to the person who you think is doing the gossip and saying, I think there is a rumor going around about me, and I really hate that because it's just not true, and I could use your help in helping me squash this rumor. So you're not saying that they're the one that's doing it, but you are in such a way that you're saying, hey, can you help me to get rid of this? And if people have questions, here are the facts. Is another. And then the other way is if you are the bystander. We do talk about this in the book, right? Sometimes the best person to help is not the person who is being gossiped about. Hey, I hear you saying this about this person. Would you want people talking about you that way? Because I would never talk about you that way. And I don't think it's fair for us to be having this conversation without this person in the room. So either I think we should invite them to join this conversation, or I think we should stop. And if more people did that, it would lower that helps to build that into the culture.
Wow. Super, super helpful. Brian Miles, just interestingly enough, good friend, mentor, founder of Belay, along with his wife, Shannon. They had a policy, I don't know whether it's still in place, but gossip is a fireable offense on the first occasion. And gossip is anytime you bring in a coworker and, are not solving a problem with them, just talking about them when they're not in the room, fireable offense. Fascinating. So the book is called Powerful Phrases for Dealing with Workplace Conflict. Karin, David, books available everywhere. Where can people connect with you and your work online?
Yeah, so our company is called Let's Grow Leaders. And if you go to our site and go and click on the book tab, there is a resource center that has all kinds of really practical tools and techniques. If you have a group that wants to read powerful phrases together to talk about it, we have role plays and discussion questions and templates and all kinds of ways that you can use this to not just be the only one reading this, but read it together and make sure that you can implement and really take some action.
And if you like listening, as you're listening to this podcast, we do narrate the audio version of the book. So if you're a book listener, you can get Karin and I there, as well as e-formats, paperback, however it works for you.
That's great. Well, I'll tell you, this has been super practical. You helped a lot of leaders today. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Karin and David.
We really appreciate it too, Carey. Thanks so much for such a good conversation.